All right, guys, I'll be right back in a second. All right, 12:30. Let's get rolling. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together this afternoon. Thank you for all the blessings that you've given us, and thank you for uh, just being there for us, Lord. I pray that you would continue to give us the focus, the determination, and the wherewithal to make it through this semester. Help us to um, focus on the things that we can control and to accomplish all the things that we need to get done. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Oh, people are still rolling in. This is the hot ticket class today, guys. The hot ticket class. All right. So. Here we are. It's Friday-ish, Thursday. So it's basically Friday, right? Basically the same thing. So let's start with recap, right? All right. So people are confused about reducing equations. Right. This is the part of the process that I call it equation reduction. You can think of it as equation creation. Um, so you take your free body diagram, you write down your inputs, your outputs, you look at your mathematical truths, right? And then you fill in the mathematical truths with the things that are on your free body diagram. And you want things to only be in terms of your inputs and your outputs, right? And you only want to put your inputs on one side and your outputs on the other, right? That is the idea behind equation reduction. Now, before we go any further here, you're going to notice that these lights are going to turn on and off the entire class. And I apologize for that, but you know, it's going to be annoying and it's going to happen. So let's just all make peace with it now. All right. So we've got our equations, right? We've got our mathematical truths written, like sum of forces equals mass times acceleration. We look at our free body diagram, right? And our free body diagram is going to have all of the forces that we have acting on our body, right? And so we sum them, we add them all together, taking into account the sign, right? Are they positive or are they negative, right? That's what equation reduction is for. Nothing rotational springs. That doesn't make sense to me. People are confused by the quizzer. You should be. He is enigmatic and very powerful. So you should be confused by him. Why was he created? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. All right. Rafa is rotation about a fixed axis. This is a purely rotational system. That is a term that we use to describe something that is in pure rotation. Right. So think about a windmill, right? The blades of a windmill are pure rotation. They're rotating about that axle. Right? They're rotating about that axle. Free body diagrams. If you're still having issues with FBDs, please come to office hours. That's a good place that we can talk about that and we can get some more practice. All right. Do you guys have any other major issues, comments, concerns as of right now? Anything that you want to bring up from last class that I didn't talk about in our recap?
So today, and I was kind of spacing out and getting right here. So you are going over like reduction and making mathematical models?
That's all today is just problems.
Heck yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
You guys are gonna do some serious problems. I'm gonna sit around and I'm gonna, drink coffee, my feet up in my hammock over here. Right? That's my plan. That's my plan. Except I don't have a hammock and I'm out of coffee right now. So, wah, wah, wah. All right. Pendulum Lab. For those of you who don't check Discord, you wouldn't have noticed this maybe, but the Pendulum Lab got pushed to today. So it is due tonight. Please turn it in by midnight, well, 11:59 tonight. Because technically midnight is tomorrow. And if you turn it in tomorrow, the clock starts running on the lateness, right? Okay, great. So there's that. Yeah, homework due on Sunday. So do the homework. Turn it in by Sunday. Okay, cool. So here we go. All right, cool. That's an excellent segue and transition. I know. So we're gonna do time trials today. You guys remember that from last week, right? Same deal as last week. No chag, right? Just don't use anything, right? Especially your Fitbit. Your Fitbit, I guarantee your Fitbit cannot help you with this. Guaranteed. Calculator and handwritten notes. Okay. Calculator. Are we gonna have to plug in numbers? No, not. So calculator is really not going to help you either. But you can use it if you want. You can. This is how the points work, right? So if you finish first, you get 8 points, right? Call me into your breakout room when you think that you've got the answer. Let's see. It did it. It did the thing. Excellent. So good. Perfect. Perfect. All right. So here's your problem. You will get 20 minutes to work on this problem. A 2 degree of freedom mechanical system with a damper and a spring in series is shown in figure 1. The independent displacement of the mass is Z1, and the independent displacement of the node is Z2. The node is that black dot in between the damper and the spring. The spring is undeflected when Z1 is equal to Z2 is equal to 0, and you have an external force F sub A of T that acts on the mass. You are going to derive the mathematical models. Okay, I will jump around from your, I will jump around into your groups, all right? You have 20 minutes. I'm going to give you another couple seconds. Hopefully I'm stalling long enough for you to either screenshot or write down the information that is on the screen right now. Ready? I'm going to start them. I'm getting up. Is everybody good? Everybody have it written down? Somebody, at least somebody? All right, cool. There you go. All righty. Arnolfo, which team are you in?
I'm on the 0 division.
0 division. That's right.
Division by 0.
Okay, there you go. Foster, you're Michael Scott Paper Company, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. See you guys. Now, if you're watching this live, get off of YouTube and get back in your groups. But if you are watching this post recording, right? I'm gonna jump around to breakout rooms and you're gonna see blackness likely for this part. But hey, you watching at home, you probably didn't figure out that you were supposed to draw a free body diagram for the massless node. What's up, Jesse? What team are you on? Are you Michael Scott Paper Company? Muted. You're muted. Hey, Jesse. You're muted. There you go. What team are you on? Your sound is not working. All right, hold on.
Hello?
Yeah.
I was part of the dollar amount one. It
Okay.
was 300 and something. It was the price of Disneyland.
Yes, there you go. All right. Let me throw you in there. And then you can... All right.
Perfect.
See you in a minute.
Looking good, Zach.
What?
I didn't say anything. It's all good.
My hair is long and voluminous, brother. I'm jealous.
2 years, man. Only clipped it once. It's the way to go.
Dang. I'm about a year in.
All right. We're back. Back, man. All right, so we've got we had people placed first, second, and third. Everyone else is going to be fourth. So that's how it works. That's how it works today. So we're not going to talk about this problem at all, you guys. We're going to go over it. All right. So what did we do? Right. So first of all, is there always going to be a trick? Right. Last week you put in that problem for time trials about how we had the vertical thing with the spring, and you know there was that trick with you could cancel the weight. And then this week there's this massless node that nobody's ever talked about massless node before. So that's yeah, probably. It's probably going to be something. You're probably going to have to think about it, right? You're probably going to have to think about the problems when we do them. Just FYI, right? So free body diagram, what are we going to do, right? Well, let me start with the node. And this is how I'm going to draw my massless node. Okay. Here it is. I know, it's crazy. And here's my mass. Now, notice the difference between the massless node and the thing that has mass. The massless node has no M in it, and also is a dashed line, right? But the mass has an M in it and is a solid line. What do we call this? Z2, Z1. Also notice something here. I'd like you to notice something. I have assumed that Z1 is larger than Z2. Why is that important? Because that tells me which way I have picked my spring to move, right? My spring force says that this is in extension, right? I am extending my spring, so it's fighting me. It's wanting to pull back to center. Because I've done that, I've assumed that this mass M is moving more than the node, right? It's moving more than the node. That's going to be important because this is a free end spring, which means it scales with relative displacement. Relative displacement. What if we had a KD for this? What if we had a KD for this? Okay. And okay, so a lot of us, I think I asked this question to all the groups, but I'm going to ask it again. What is the mass of a massless node?
0.
0, that's right. So if the mass of a massless node is 0, right, and I said this on like the first day of statics in ESG-455, right, there's two cases when we have static equilibrium, right? When the sum of the forces is 0. When is that? Well, that's when either the acceleration is 0 or the mass is 0. And one of those cases is infinitely more interesting than the other, right? But does not change the fact that this is going to be 0, right? There's no inertia. Another way of thinking about this is there's no mass, there's no inertia that I have to overcome to make it move, right? It's just going to move. Could you have done this pointing your forces in the other way and assuming that Z2 was larger than Z1? Sure, you could have. There exists a condition, I suppose, where that would happen, right? So you could have done that. You will find that you'll get the same model. It will be equivalent because the signs will work themselves out. All right, cool. So that's that, right? What are my inputs and my outputs? Well, my input is FA of T, and my output is what? Well, Z1 and Z2. I have multiple outputs, right? Because I'm pulling on the front block, both the node and the block itself are going to move. They are both the output. Okay. Technically, you can make anything an output. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we go through some more problems, right? But technically, we'll go through, we can make whatever we want the output, right? It's just whatever it's whatever we're interested in analyzing when we get down the road. Okay, my mathematical truths, well, this is a linear system, or sorry, it's a translational system. And I have a damper, and I have a spring. All right, so there you go. And that's it. That's them's the truth, man. Right, them's the truths. So now we can get into our reduction, right? So again, we're talking about the reduction of equations, right? The reduction of equations is how do I apply these mathematical truths to the system that I just drew, right? How am I going to make my equations? Well, let's go back and look at the free body diagram. Do you guys want to start at the massless node, or do you guys want to start at the mass? Which one? Dealer's choice.
The mass.
The mass. All right. Sure. So if we're in the mass, right, here we are. Just so we remember, like, everything having to do with the mass is on the right-hand side of the dashed line. So if I'm summing my forces, what do I have? Well, I have my applied force, and I have negative spring force. Okay. Now, you're probably like wondering, well, Dr. D, we didn't use X, right? Well, I wrote this for the general case, right? We can certainly make this more specific when we put our Z here, 2, right? And of course, this, so we remember that we should definitely write this. And that's true for what I have drawn. Might not be true for how you did the problem, so just be aware. All right, so we're going to start with the mass. And for our mass, we're going to sum our forces, right? So we have F negative Fk plus Fa T is equal to mz double dot 1. Okay. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to plug in and rearrange a little bit. So I'll have mz double dot 1. I'm going to plug in for my spring, right? But I'm going to bring the spring force over to the other side. So I'm going to add Fk, right? But we also know that K is Z1 plus Z2. And that's going to equal my applied force. And I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to call that equation 1 for right now. And underline it with red. Because I have black, red, green, and blue. And so that's why I used red.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why is it why is it Z1 plus Z2 instead of Z2 minus?
Because that's called a typo, even though I'm handwriting.
Okay, I was like,
I did that on purpose. I'm glad you caught it. I didn't do that on purpose. Thanks for catching that, though. That would have been very confusing. You know, I just get so excited about these problems that I can't even copy my own notes. That's basically what happened. Anyway, that's it, right? That's the mass. So what about this massless node that everybody's talking so much about? Well, let's sum our forces there, right? Well, what do we get? Well, we get Fk minus Fb is equal to mz double dot 2, right? But we already covered this, right? That's going to be 0. So I can rewrite this as K Z1 minus Z2 is equal to B C dot 2. Now I'm just going to leave it like that. You don't have to plug it back in, right? You can just leave it like that. That would be fine. That would be fine. But say for a minute that, you were like, no, I'm gonna plug it in, right? What would it look like? A total synopsis of this, right? Would be so interesting, right? In this configuration, if we're going from one end to the other, right? If we're going from one end to the other, turns out that the spring, is the damper takes the place of the spring, right? What if you did it the other way, right? Because the question was asked, right? What if K was where B was and B was where K was, right? What if I flip my damper and my spring? Well, you get a slightly different result, right? Because you end up with the damper being, now this becomes KZ2, MZ1 plus KZ2, right? So it's a slightly different equation with a slightly different set of dynamics. Slightly. Everybody cool with that? Feeling okay?
I have a question, Dr. D.
Yes. What's up?
So how do you do how do you assume that Z2 is bigger than Z1? Like, why do you make that assumption?
Why? Because I have to draw my force in a specific direction, right? So I assumed that it's arbitrary, really, in a sense, right? But I decided here that I was going to draw that spring being in tension, right? And if I draw it in tension, that means that the first one has to move more than the second. If you drew it in compression, that's fine too, right? It's just that that's how my brain prefers to think about this working, right? So it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. Remember, there's a couple of things about springs, and I'm going to draw it right on this. I'll go back one out and draw it. All right, so here, imagine for a second you've got this spring, right? And I'm going to say that if it's in tension, right, it's going to want to pull, the reaction force is to pull back in, right? If it's in compression, it's going to want to pull back out. It doesn't matter which direction you decide it's going to move in. But what this does affect is whether, right, whether you write Fk is equal to K Z1 minus Z2, or Fk is equal to K Z2 minus Z1. That's what it affects, right? So another way of thinking about this, right, is what? Well, that's just a change in sign, right? If I multiply the top one by -1, I get the bottom one, right? So it's just flipping your sign. That's all that it's doing, right? Which makes sense. Now for springs, there are two cases here that will always be wrong. And, I'm pretty sure you can be punished to the full extent of the law for doing these. If you draw a force in this direction or in this direction, that is very, very wrong. Very wrong. Right? It makes no physical sense. That is not how springs work. Okay? So you've now all seen that those are wrong. So don't do them. Right? But to answer your question, Jose, it doesn't matter. The signs will take care of themselves, but you're going to have to make an assumption when you do the problem. Do whatever you think is more intuitive to you. Okay? Treat it the way that you think it should be treated, and then just follow through with your signs. I will grade it however you decide to draw it. But if you drew the red arrows, right, if you drew this intention and you wrote the equation for compression, those things don't match, right? So make sure that you're adequately describing it mathematically.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good question. Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, oh, oh. Oh, all right. Well, if there are no other questions, then what? Well, then we're going to do this one. And Chris Obook, come on down. You're the next contestant. The example problem is right. So I'll give you the main stage here. The main stage.
Should I try drawing it or?
If you want to try to draw it, you can.
Okay, I've got it written down on paper, but I
Put
can.
it up if you want. It's fine. Just walk us through what you did.
Okay, I can't. I'm not sure how to draw it, so I'll just show my paper. Cool. Okay, so okay, so here's what I've got. I've got it broken up into two different free bodies. The first free body is that gear, and so I've got the torque. That's our input, and then there's our theta, and there's radius, and then there's the force, a force acting on it right there, which is basically this force right here from the teeth on the square thing going to the teeth on the gear. And then, oh, did I lose it? Oh, no, just kidding. And then over here, I've got the, so I've got the force, that's the spring. And then I've got this force here, which is just it acting with that. And then I've got a frictional force, because it's just sliding on that.
Okay. So stop there for a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
That frictional force. So if you look back at the main schematic, right, you'll see that there's a little C drawn next to the rack, like on that thing, and that's trying to tell you that there's damping in between the rack and what it's sliding. So instead of like a dry friction with mu, that's gonna actually be F sub B, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How
So just
how
so
does
you,
that work? Like in the physical sense, like would that be like an oil on the surface of that, or?
yeah, it'd be like lubricant.
Okay.
So just so you guys know, if you see, so I pull these problems from different sources, right? And if you see a C in the problem, they're trying to tell you that that's damping. Damping is either B or C, depending on who you're talking to. And you'll see I or J, right? Those are rotational inertias are either I or J. I prefer to use J, but do what you like. Yeah. So yeah, so now your mathematical truths look good, right? You probably just have to update your equations a little bit, right? But yeah, overall, so far so good, right? Inputs, outputs, right? All right. So thanks, Chris. I'm gonna go ahead and share a screen and draw a free body diagram too, just so it's up here and people can refer back to it if they want to as well. Right? I did notice that you chose theta to go the opposite way that was drawn on the diagram, right? Which is fine, right? Which is fine. I don't blame you. I prefer it to go the other way. But just for the sake of, I'm going to do it the other way. So your equations may have a sign flipped somewhere, right? and look a little different than where we're going to end up. So F sub C, right? So what is a rack and pinion used for, guys? What is the most common application of a rack and pinion gear set?
Steering in a vehicle. I know that.
Yeah, steering. That's steering.
All sorts of things.
All sorts. They're
No,
everywhere.
seriously, and just changing a rotational motion to a translational motion.
Yeah. They're used all. I'm looking at one right now. No, yeah, exactly. It's a way for us to transform rotation into translation. Right? That's the big thing. So you know, like a drawbridge, right? Drawbridge. Portcullis. Right.
Wait, why is FOC on the wheel going to the right? Like if the mass is hitting it, forcing it to turn clockwise, shouldn't that force be going to the left? Or
Because there is a reaction from
how
that's
is the reaction force?
the
Okay.
other thing from the rack. Also, it doesn't matter. It's an internal force. Once we put it back together, as long as they're equal and opposite, it doesn't matter which way you pick it. They're going to cancel each other out, right? So as long as you pick them, again, much like the spring, right? It's very wrong for them to be in the same direction. But as long as they're in opposite directions, then we're good. So we had our inputs, right? Our input was that torque. And our output was X, right? So we apply some torque, we get some sliding of the rack, right? Except that that's all well and good and fine. But we're also at the back end of this. I'm going to show you guys something else that we could do. Okay. All right. So I want to go back here for a second to the schematic. Wait for it. It'll happen. Maybe. There we go. All right, so let's take a look at this, right? So this particular schematic, it's got two rotating inertias, right? But we only drew a diagram for one, which is fine, right? But you're lumping those together. And because they are the same size, right? They have the same radius, right? You can do that. That's fine. You just add them together, right? They're the same size. But in the free body diagram that we drew, that J is really J sub M plus J sub P. Right? It's the combination of the two. Now, this doesn't really matter for the sense of making the model per se, right? More so if we were going to analyze it later, we would need to know, well, what's JM and what's JP, right? Okay. Cool. So we've got that. Throw my X there. This stuff going on. All right, so what are my truths, right? Well, Chris had the truths. It was T is equal to J theta double dot. We had torque of the, I'm sorry, not the torque. We had, that's it for the rotational side, right? And then the translational side, we've got the force is equal to mx double dot. We've got the spring is equal to K, just Kx. And our damper force is equal to B x dot. Also, we talked about this, but I'm going to say that J is equal to Jm plus J. Just to remind myself later, in case you actually have to do anything with this system, right, in terms of analysis. All right, cool. So where do you want to start, Chris? Do you want us to start at the rack or at the pinion? Where did you start? Where did you start?
Started at the pinion.
The pinion. All right. So what do we do? Right? We gotta apply our Newton's second law there, right?
Mhm.
So what's the sum of our torques for the rotational portion?
So we have the negative Tn, that torque, the applied torque, plus the F sub C times the radius to get a torque.
Remember, guys, in his free body diagram, theta was going the other way, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
No, that's fine. That's, again, completely valid, right? You can do it
Mhm.
either way, right? Because we went over how coordinate systems are an invention of humans, right? And therefore inherently flawed. Right? So if we're gonna sum our torques for this particular one, right, we got J theta double dot is equal to my applied torque minus F sub C. Let me use the same F sub C times R, right? Okay, great. Now, what if you don't remember, what if you're in a bind and you don't remember how to make a force into a torque, right? How a force produces a torque, right? What if you don't remember that, right? Okay. Well, what are the units for torque or moment? What are they?
Newton meter.
Yeah, it's a Newton meter, right? Or a foot pound if you're not, heathen, right? But anyway,
Boo.
right, so it's a Newton meter. What is that? That's a force times a distance, right? It's a force times a distance. And just for the record, metric system all the way, right? Metric system all the way. Right? The thing that does it for me is the slug. I can't get past the slugs. So cannot. Anyway, I do think it's cute how we tried to make the English system of units more SI by including kilopounds or kips. That was cute. But
You don't like escargot?
yeah. Professor Tomford actually shared with me a very nerdy video about creating systems of units that was pretty funny. If you want to look up the 7 C's system of units on YouTube, then in your spare time, then check it out. It was pretty good. Anyway, so here we are, right? We got this, and that's where we're going to leave this, right? That's it. We've got our inputs on one side, we got our outputs on the other. Well, do we really? Well, not yet, right? Because we need X, right? We want X, but we don't have X yet. Why? Why? Because X is coupled through that contact force, right? So if we're talking about this, right, we've got our pinion here, and then we'll move on to the rack, right? Move on to the rack. So let's go back to our free body diagram. We'll take a look at this, right? So for the rack, what do we have? We're going to sum our forces here as well, right? So what forces do we have acting on the rack in the direction of motion? Now, I want you guys to realize that my free body diagram is not really complete, right? There is definitely a normal force. There is definitely a weight, right, that I haven't drawn. Why didn't I draw it? Because we're not moving in that direction, right? I'm really only concerned with analyzing this in the direction of motion, right? And so I've limited my forces that I've drawn into the direction that we are actually going to be moving. So it is not technically a complete free body diagram, okay? I know. Shame on me, right? Shame on me, all that. But how do we sum the forces here in the X direction? What do we have going on?
So I've got negative that FK plus that FC and then minus the FB. That's all.
Right, so if I'm going to sum these, right, I've got MX double dot is equal to negative FK minus FB plus F C. Right. So there you go. Okay. So we can plug in some things here, right? This one will be a little bit more interesting than the last one. See? All right, and then we bring some algebra home for the win, right? Algebra for the win. And I'm going to call that equation 2, right? And normally we would stop here, right? But the problem that we have is we have 2 equations and neither of them are in terms of just our input and just our output, right? Neither of these equations are in terms of just our input or just our output. So we have a little bit more legwork to do, right? Why? Well, because of the contact force, right? Yes, we are coupled through that contact force, but contact force is not something that we are going to be able to measure directly, right? Imagine trying to instrument with a bunch of little force sensors in between each tooth of that gear. There's multiple reasons why this is a bad idea, not the smallest of which being that, first of all, you're going to junk up your gear. Second of all, you're going to destroy all of your sensors, right? So there's no good way of measuring that force. Now, there are really good ways of measuring the positional change of the rack or the positional change of the pinion, right? Of measuring theta or x. So we're going to have to combine these, right? So we have to do a little bit more algebra, and we're going to have to put equation 1 and equation 2 together. Now, luckily, the way that we've set this up, we already solved for f sub c, right? So we just plug that directly in to this equation in the top, right? So plug equation 2 into equation 1, and we do the thing, and we'll get something that looks like this. Okay. Now that's interesting too, right? Because it gets us a step closer, but it's not done yet, right? It gets us a step closer, but we're not done because we still have theta. And our input was t and our output was x. So we need to get theta in terms of x, right? We need to get theta in terms of x. So how do we get theta in terms of x, right? Any ideas?
Is this going to be like some like circumference of the circle is radius times angle or something like that? Maybe? No. Fine.
Kinda.
What happened to the x on k, kx?
There should be an x on there, Noah. Okay. You guys caught it again. You guys, I'm doing these things on purpose. You keep catching it. It's great. It's so Trevor, you're kind of there. I feel like you're remembering something from a dynamics class gone by, right? And you're sitting in room 1345 GCU, right? And Professor Tomford is talking and she's jumping up and down because that's how I envision how she teaches, right? She's jumping around the room, right? And she's probably telling you something, doing a proof, right? We're doing a proof where x is equal to r times theta, right? So the amount of translation that you have from going through, so if you imagine a wheel, if you will, a wheel that is rolling down the road, right? And in one revolution, if it goes through 360 degrees or 2 pi, let's say, right? That's going to give us the ratio of 2 pi to the angle that we've rotated through is equivalent to the circumference, the ratio of the circumference of that circle to the linear distance that we've traveled, right? That is to say that if you complete one revolution, right, of that wheel, you will have traveled the translational distance equivalent to the circumference of the wheel, right? And so that's where this comes from. But if we take the derivative and we take the derivative again, we get this, right? And this is very useful because I can algebra this into this, right? Did I do that? Yeah, I did that right. Look at that. So I can algebra that equation into this. Well, look, hey, there's a theta double dot. There's a theta double dot. Why don't we just do J over R times X double dot plus, and I'm gonna distribute this now, right? I'm bringing mx double dot plus bx dot plus kx over to this side, right? So I'm adding this entire thing to the other side of the equation, and I'm going to distribute the r, right? So I've got m r x double dot plus b r x dot plus k r x is equal to t, right? And we can be done like that. That can be it. That is everything in terms of x and t, right? That is it. We did it. We're there. But it doesn't look so great, and so I'm just gonna go ahead and do that and combine my like terms, right? And that's, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there. Right? But I am going to do one other thing with this, right? I'm going to do one other thing. And I'm going to say to you, what if the problem said to you directly in the problem statement, assume that theta is the output, right? Assume that theta is the output. So I need everything in terms of thetas now, right? How would I do that? We've got this up here. Oh, that's me. We got this up here, right? Too much, Taylor, too much. We don't need to use trig functions for this. It's too much. Doing too much, do less, right? Doing too much. Well, now you're just laying there. You gotta do more than that. Okay, anyway. Here we are. Well, we've got all these things. So x double dot is just r theta double dot, right? So I can plug that back in. What if theta was the output? What if? I know it's an exciting world that we live in. That might actually I can't even begin to believe it, right? But we've got this. Well, x double dot is just r theta double dot. B times r. X dot is r theta dot. K times r. X is just r theta. That's equal to t. All right, so I can throw some things in here, right? So I get j plus m r squared theta double dot plus b r squared theta dot plus k r squared. Theta is equal to the torque. And that's what would happen if theta was the output. That's how we would do it. Okay. Notice here what I have, right? I've got, let me use a different color to highlight that. I've got this term in front of my theta double dot, right? I've got this term in front of my theta double dot. This is J effective, right? That is my total inertia for the system. It's Jeff. Jeff's here. Everybody likes Jeff. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about this? No? Everybody's all right? We're following along. We're doing okay? Nothing crazy yet? Yet? Okay. All right. So, Zach, this one's for you. How'd you do?
Sweet. So you want to just show the free body diagram that I have kind of written out?
Yeah. Let's do
All
that.
right. I'll do it as best as I can. I broke it up into two different wheels. So here I have, let's see, that one's the wheel for the P, and this one's the wheel for the D, because they're split up.
Sure.
And I went and I denoted my positive rotation, and here's my whatever that's called. Was that theta?
Yeah.
Theta P, and then I've got the dampener acting on it, and I've also got the spring acting on it.
Mhm.
And then this other one, I have my theta D, and I have the dampener acting on that as well.
Okay. So is your damper it's acting in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, correct.
Good.
Correct. And then I have my assumptions here that phi is greater than theta P and theta P is greater than theta D.
So just a heads up, right? So your damper on the second part of it needs to be the opposite way. And the reason is, think of it this way, right? The damper is a physical construct that's actually there, right? And so you're trying to show the reaction force from it being gone, right? Because of that, it's not going to just be opposing the motion. It's going to be equal and opposite, right? You have to have them both equal and opposite. The same way that springs have to be equal and opposite, dampers acting on two separate bodies, if it's the same damper, have to be equal and opposite, okay? So you actually have them rotating, the torques rotating in the same direction, right?
Yeah.
So you need to flip either the one on TD or the one on JD or the one on JP.
I'll just flip the one on JP then.
All right, cool. That's good. And so you said phi was greater than theta, P was greater than theta D. That's what you assumed?
Yeah, that's what I assumed.
All right, cool. Yeah, that looks pretty good.
Sick.
What do you got for a mathematical truth or inputs and outputs? How about that?
So input, I assumed it was phi, and output, I put theta P and theta D.
Yeah. Yep.
You wanted to go down to mathematical truths?
Yeah. Let's do that.
All right. So I have, let's see, I got torque equals to J theta double dot.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the dampener equal to B theta single dot. Oh, here you go.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the spring, I have the spring equal to K times phi minus theta P.
So for the damper, right, again, that has free ends like the spring, right? It's both sides are moving at different rates, right?
Yeah.
That theta dot D and theta dot P are potentially different, right? And so how do we accommodate that, right? The same way that we do with the spring, we need to talk about the relative velocity of the damper, right? Ooh. Cool.
So would it be theta P minus theta D then?
So let me see what you got. So it'd be theta dot, right? Because it's
theta dot.
Velocity. But based on how it's going to be based on how you've drawn it, essentially, right? So if you like the way that you said, if P is greater than D, then your damper is going to be fighting the position on JP, but actually going in the same direction of rotation on JP. So it's rough with rotations to think about it. So I like to talk about it with linear systems, right? So for example, if I had two matchbox cars, right, and they were connected by a spring, right? One's in the lead and one's rear, right? And I move the first one and the second one at the same velocity, right? The spring length isn't changing, right? If I move them, all right, let's say there's a damper connection, right? If I move the first one faster than the second one, right? So if I'm going at 10 meters per second with the first one and 5 with the second one, the net change in velocity that's being damped is 5 meters per second. Whereas if I was moving the second one faster than the first one, they'd be working in the opposite direction, right? So you have to keep that in mind when you're drawing these. And for rotations, it's tricky to think about. So the best thing that I can say for kind of like rule of thumb for stuff like that is whichever mass is driving the system, draw it against motion for that one, right? And then draw it as equal yet opposite on the other one, right? So in this case, JP is driving the motion of JP, right? We're starting with phi, and that kicks on down the line further and further, right? And so I chose my torque to be in the direct, or my damping torque to be in here. You know, why don't I draw my free body diagram? That might be easier to talk about it while we're doing it. No. Come on. There we go. Yes, hopefully see that now. All right, so I got JP and I got JB, right? And so we were told that this is going to be moving in this direction, right? Based on our assumptions here, TK goes that way. And, oops, sorry. And TK is going to be, oh no, sorry. Again, sorry, TK is not on that one. And I'm going to assume, in this case, right, I'm going to assume that TB is opposite the motion of this disk, right? Which means that if I've got this thing going this way, I'm going to assume that this damping has to be equal and opposite to the first one, right? So the way that I treat damping is if I am absolutely sure based on the way, so again, I assume that I'm actually rotating in the direction that's positive. I personally am always assuming that everything is moving positively, right? And that's just a convention. You have to do that. No, I prefer to do it this way because if everything is moving positive, right, then I know that if it comes out negative, I chose wrong, right? And it's actually moving the other way. So if it's moving positive, then this damping, since this disk is driving disk B, right? P drives D, right? We start again. We're gonna go back to our schematic, right? We start with phi, right? We're adding some rotation to our system, phi. Phi drives the entire thing, right? But it kicks down sequentially, right? Phi drives J sub P, right? Which drives J sub D, right? And so that's how we're gonna look at it. Well, that's how I always kind of think about it, right? And so this torque has to be opposing this motion, which means that because they're rigidly connected, this torque has to be equal and opposite to the other one, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Cool, right? And so we said assume phi greater than theta p greater than theta d, which would also imply that phi dot is greater than theta dot p greater than theta dot. Right? That's what it would imply. Okay. So we've got our inputs and our outputs, right? we said that that's going to be phi and theta p and theta d. So input phi, output theta p and theta d, right? Mathematical truths, we had those down. That's j theta double dots. We've got t sub b is equal to b, and I've got the way that we've drawn it, theta p minus theta, or theta dot p minus theta dot d, and t sub k as how you had it, phi minus theta p. Right, and again, I just want to show this, right? This spring, right, this spring, if we're assuming that it's moving on this side and this is driving my motion, I'm going to assume that that is TK, right, on this side, which means it has to be the other way here, right? And so I actually drew it the wrong side. That's why I have TK pointing this way, right? So let's go back and let's talk about this, right? If I'm rotating by phi on the front end of that spring, right? The torque reaction is going to oppose this motion, right? Because that's, think about it this way, right? The spring, as I rotate it, it wants to fight back, right? Which means on the other end, it's going to be equal and opposite. So it's got to go in the opposite direction. Yeah. Does that make sense? It's hard to think about rotational springs in terms of compression and extension, for me at least. I mean, I'm not, it's harder for me to wrap my head around in some cases. Okay, so here we are, right? We've got our equations, we've got, so we can do our reduction. So how are we gonna do that, right? Well, you guys want to start, Zach, did you start with P or with D?
I started with P.
Yeah, okay. So let's start with P then, right? Start with P. So if we're looking at JP, right, we go back to our free body diagram. What are the sum of my torques on JP?
You've got TK minus TC.
Yep. Right, so TK minus TC or TB, whatever you like, is equal to JP theta double dot P, right? We can plug some things in now. I will move this over to this side because I like it to be there instead. That's going to be equal to K times P minus theta P minus B times theta P, theta dot P, sorry, minus theta dot D. Okay. And then we'll do some algebra, right? We'll do some algebra. We're going to distribute these things and we're going to say JP theta double dot P plus B theta dot P minus theta dot D plus K theta P is equal to K phi. I'm going to call it, right? So what did I do? I expanded this for K, right? Why? I want my inputs on one side and my outputs on the other. That is what I want. If I don't have things in terms of inputs and outputs, I think we've shown through previous problems that we need to figure out how to get things in terms of our inputs and our outputs. And this is going to be an issue that's not immediately apparent until we start doing analysis, right? When we start talking about analysis, there's a reason, I keep saying this, right? There's a reason why we're doing the things that we're doing. And it's not just because, you know, I'm mean and I just need you to do these things, right? There's an actual reason. And if I start talking about it now, you're going to look at me, you're going to glaze over, right? And you're going to wake up and it's going to be Tuesday and it's going to be time for class again, right? And we're not interested in having that happen. So we're just gonna hold on to it. Just trust me. Just trust me. There's a reason for this. I promise. I promise there's a payoff. It's just gonna. It's a long con, right? This is a long con. Okay? That's our first equation. We just leave it like that, right? We just leave it like that. So let's talk about J sub D. All right. So let's sum the torques on J sub D. What do we got?
TB.
That's it, right? That is it. So I would end up with JD theta double dot D is equal to TB, which is equal to B times theta dot P minus theta dot D, right? And you can actually report this one of two ways, right? And then we'll talk about it. It's a good place for me to talk about this, right? So obviously, the easiest thing to do is just do the algebra, get everything over to one side because phi is not present here, right? There is no phi in this equation, therefore the input is 0, right? Well, that doesn't sit well sometimes, right? So we can talk about this idea of a global input and a local input. And what do I mean by that? Right? We talked about it a little bit last class, I believe, right? But we'll go over it here again. Right, so let's get back here. All right, so here's phi. Phi is my global input. What do I mean by that? Well, if we're thinking about the system as globally, right? We're thinking about the system globally, meaning we're thinking about it as a whole, the entirety of the system. The system, the input to the whole system is phi. That is what is driving it, right? That is the system's total input. The total output are both theta P and theta D because they consequentially move based off of that input, right? But what if we wanted to talk about this locally? What do I mean by that? Well, what if I only wanted to analyze the front half, right? The spring and JP. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. Maybe you only want the dynamic response of part of your system for some reason, right? Maybe you want to see specifically how that output affects just that input, right? Or that output is affected by that input, sorry, right? So you can look just here, right? And the local output for the first half of the system is just theta P, right? Now, what if you look just at the system of JP and JP? Well, your local input is theta P, and your local output becomes theta D, right? So you can break down a system into its parts and analyze just a part, and that's fine, right? But that also defines how we can draw our equations, right? How we can write our equations. So in this case, if I wanted this in terms of a local input and a local output, right, I would have all my theta Ds on one side and set them equal to my theta Ps.
Hey, Doc,
Right? What's
in
up?
that line above, did you intentionally swap the theta D and P, or
What's that now?
the line just above the red dashed ones in the B term?
Oh, this one where the D and the P are flipped?
Yes.
Now let me ask you, Blake, if I algebra this to bring this over, right? This would just become right? Aren't these two expressions equivalent? I'm just multiplying through by that -1. That's why it's positive there now.
Okay,
Right.
gotcha.
So yeah, I just skipped an algebra step when I showed it.
I see, I see.
This is the point where I look right in the camera and I tell you, Did you guys remember how all of your teachers always told you that you would never need algebra ever again in your life? They lied. They all lied right to your face. Okay, all of them.
They didn't know we were going to be engineering majors.
It's not even just engineering. If you want to make a budget for your daily life, right? You want to figure out, can I afford the new Xbox Series X that's coming out, right? Well, you better solve for X, man. You better solve. Anyway, here we are, right? So this idea of a local output and a local input is useful. It's useful when we're doing analysis, right? We can break our systems down into pieces and test just the pieces. It's really nice for like mixed systems, like electromechanical systems, where I can look just at the electrical response or just at the mechanical response, right? I don't have to look at the response of the entire system as a whole, right? And so in certain cases, it's advantageous for us to think about these in terms of local inputs and outputs as opposed to global. Now, for you guys right now, I would be happy if you had either of these two implementations written here, right, as your final. It's fine for me, either one. If you wrote equation 2 or local equation 2, let's call it, right? I would be happy with that, right? But as long as you're getting it down to an input-output relationship, I'm fine. Right? You guys have any questions on this one?
Yeah, I've got a question about it. Would you want us to go and combine both equation 1 and 2 so that you have phi, theta p, and theta d in the same problem?
Ooh. No. I want you to leave them as separate equations, Zach. And there's a reason for that. Because right now, if you solve one of these for like theta dot p, right? And you want to, so say for example, you solve equation 2 for theta dot p, right? You would need to take the integral of that equation in order to substitute it into theta p. And that's gross. Okay. But once we get to Laplace transforms, it's a matter of doing some algebraic manipulation to get everything into a single, let's call it a master equation. But for right now, I want you guys to leave them like this. And this also feeds into when we get to state space equations, right? State space equations is going to be much nicer for us to have them as separate ODEs. So we're just, for right now, 2 equations. Don't take the time to, don't waste your time doing the extra work, right? Just leave them as 2 separate equations. Good question. Okay, any other questions? Okay. All right, if there's no other questions, thanks, Zach. That was good stuff. Let's move on to this guy, Sean Fuller. Come on down.
Nope.
I will cede control of the class to you.
All right, so I drew my free body diagram. I had J1, J2, J1. There was the radius, torque 1, and then the forced contact.
Mm-hmm.
And then J2 had the TB, the forced contact, and then force of the spring with the radius 2. I assumed that theta 2 was going to be greater than theta 3.
Okay.
And my input was
3 on your free body diagram. I was gonna ask you that.
I don't have theta 3 on here. I wasn't sure where that would go.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that too. But so far, so the way to think about this, right, is because they give you the rotation of that gear, you got to do 3 free body diagrams. One for the initial mass and inertia, one for just the gear, and then one for that final J2, right? So you missed one spot, but I like where your head's at with this is the appropriate free body diagram for J2, right? You've got the spring and you've got TB. It just doesn't have the contact force. So you're right there. You're right there. Very close. What else you got? So you got the input is T1 and the output is theta 3, which is valid and good. And I would say that's good to go. Let's talk about the truths, because the truths shouldn't change very much, right? And then we'll go back and we'll talk about free body diagrams, right? So what do you have for the mathematical truths?
Sum of t is equal to j theta double dot.
Mhm.
Tk is equal to k of theta 2 minus theta 3. And then tb is equal to k theta dot.
So TB should be equal to the damping times the theta dot, right? So B, not
Oh,
K.
I wrote that wrong.
It's all right. It's all right. It happens. Cool. All right. Yeah. And so it seems like you've got your truths sorted, right? It's just this one was tricky with the free body diagram. We haven't really handled anything that's had essentially three inputs, right? So how do we do that? Right? What does a free body diagram look like? So let's talk about what this is doing, right? And why this is slightly different than the other gear problems that we've encountered, right? So this is doing what you think it's doing, right? It is, you're applying a torque, you're getting a positional output for theta 1, for theta 2, and for theta 3, right? But notice that the gear, even though the size isn't called out on this drawing, the gear is technically smaller than that other inertia, right? Another thing that's important here is that there is no inertia called out on the gear, right? So we're assuming that this is an ideal gear train, right? And the fact that they're telling you that theta 2 and theta 3 are different by calling them out as different variables is important, because it's telling you that there's a different rotation for each one. Okay. So keep that in mind. Okay, so looking at this, right? If we're going to do a free body diagram, there's 2 ways. And I am going to show you both ways to do the free body diagram, but then I'm going to show you a single way to do the problem. And I promised this morning's class that I would put a video on YouTube of how to do it the alternate way, that I'm not going to do it in class today. Okay? So just keep that in mind as we're going here, right? So Sean had some good stuff, right? We've got J1, right? And we've got our torque. Let's call this T1 because that's what it's called. And we've got theta 1. And, we've got our contact force, right? Cool. Then we're going to come down to the gear, right? So the interface, right? So essentially, let's go back to our schematic. So what am I doing here? I'm assuming that the entire first portion, right? The entirety of that first inertia is lumped and it is in the gear, right? This whole section I've lumped into one inertia, right? I just want to be clear about that. I've lumped all this into one inertia. So again, why is it inappropriate for us to lump all of this into one inertia? And it's because these are different rotations. It's because the rotations are different. So we can't just lump it, right? Can't just lump it. All right. So let's look at the gear. Right, so here's my gear. It's going to have some rotation in this direction, right? And I'm going to have some contact force at the top here that I will call F sub C. And I'm going to draw my stiffness going in this direction. Okay. I'm gonna draw my stiffness. Talk about this. Then I'm going to draw my final J2. Right? And J2 is also moving in the same direction. Here it's theta 3. I have some damping. The damping is going to be in the opposite direction as my motion. Right? And we're going to say that the stiffness here, we're going to say, we're assuming that theta 3 is larger than theta 2. That's what we're assuming. Assuming that theta 3 is larger than theta 2. Why would I do that? Why not? It doesn't matter, right? I've told you it doesn't matter. Just pick one and go with it, right? Just pick one and go with it. It doesn't matter. It's arbitrary. We just need to pick one. Okay. So these are the free body diagrams, right? And so we can do this whole song and dance where we analyze the first free body diagram, right? And we get something in terms of FC. And then we'll analyze the second one. We'll also get something in terms of FC, right? And then we'll have to make them equivalent, right? And create one whole equation to eliminate FC, right? We can do that. We can do that. Or we can create an equivalent system. Now, why would we want to create an equivalent system? Well, analyzing 3 free body diagrams isn't that big of a pain in the butt, right? But what if this was a more complex system, right? And you had 5, 7, 10 free body diagrams that you had to analyze and write equations for, right? That becomes tedious. So what we're going to do, well, what I'm going to show you how to do, we're going to lump all of this together. And why do we want to lump all of that together? Because we know the punchline of this portion of the system. What is the punchline? The punchline is that I know the gear ratio. So I know how this torque is transformed and is being applied on this portion of the system. So I already know what the end is here, right? I know the end. That's part. So if I was going to do that, I could draw my equivalent system, and I'll draw it down here. And I'm going to have my lumped inertia, which I'm going to call J effective, right? Or Jeff. Jeff's back. What's up, Jeff? Jeff has some torque, T effective, right? We know that this has to be moving by theta 2, right? Because we've shifted our entire system to the point where we're now past the gear. And we still have our T sub K. Still gonna be the same. Okay. And then the second part, well, it doesn't change, right? J2 doesn't change. We didn't do anything with J2. It stays the same. We're still going to have 2B, TK, and theta 3. So what does the gear ratio tell us? What does the gear ratio tell us? Just so we can remind ourselves, and I'll write it on the next page with the mathematical truths, right? What the gear ratio is going to tell us and what the gear ratio is. All right, so we're going to talk about how to get J effective. Okay, we're going to talk about it. But the reason, right, the reason that we want to cut that there, right, we're going to go over that again right now. So why do I want to do that? Again, using the gear ratio, I can figure out this. I can replace this entire front portion with an equivalent system, right, that has some effective inertia. We'll talk about how to find that effective inertia in a minute, right? Talk about how to find that effective inertia in a minute. Is everybody following me so far? Ish. We okay? You have any major issues with anything that I've done so far? Not really. Not really. I feel like that's like my tagline. You guys have any major issues with anything that I've done so far? I feel like I say that quite often. All right, anyway. All right, so these are our free body diagrams. And I'm going to solve this using this the bottom half. Okay. And again, I will provide you with a video of how to do it the longer way, right? Again, either of these ways is completely acceptable, right? I want that to be very clear. They are equivalent methods. You will get the same answer. Why? Because they are equivalent. So if you feel more comfortable doing it with each of the 3 free body diagrams, do it that way, okay? This is going to have some time savings associated with it, right? But it's not that much when we're talking about 3 free body diagrams versus 2 free body diagrams, right? This is more of something that for much more complex systems, right? So I'm going to say that my input is T, we'll call it T effective in this case. And in parentheses, I will put it's T1, right? It's obviously it's T1. T1 is what is driving the system. But in the model that we've made, it's T effective, right? T effective is driving everything. And if T effective is driving everything, then theta 2 and theta 3 are going to be my outputs. Okay. 2 and theta 3 will be my outputs.
Are you saying that the input for like the effective one is T effective, or if you're all the way, then it's T1?
So T1 drives T effective, right? T1 is related to T effective. We're going to talk about that right now, how you can figure out what T effective is based off of the gear ratio, right? But T1 is the input, and you're going to see why. Let's just talk about it right now. Let me go back here, right? So the first mathematical truth that I can write is that the gear ratio times T1 is equal to T effective, right? Whatever my gear ratio is, right? There's some torque multiplication going on here, right? There's some torque multiplication going on here. What is the gear ratio? Well, gear ratio is defined as either theta 2 divided by theta 1 or omega 2 divided by omega 1. Right? So if you know the position of the second and the position of the first, you can get your gear ratio, right? Meaning that if theta 2 is larger than theta 1, we'll have a higher gear ratio, and if theta 2 is less than theta 1, we will have a smaller gear ratio, right? That's what this is showing us. We went over gear ratio last week on Tuesday or Thursday, actually, Thursday. A week ago on this very day, probably at this very time. Okay. Everybody's cool with this here, right? The other truths are the same. We're still gonna have this, right? We're gonna have, I told you that TK, I assume that theta 3 is larger than theta 2, right? So that's what I assumed. I've got TB is B theta dot 3. And those are the truths. And the thing that's really gonna come into play here is we need to figure out what J effective is. And this is the part where you guys are gonna, we're gonna spend some time here. We're gonna spend some time here because mechanical engineers and BSc students, you're gonna have to knock some rust off, and biomeds, I apologize that you didn't have a formal dynamics class. I do. So please just try to follow me as best as you can, right? So how do we come up with Jeff, right?
I have a question before we move on.
Yeah.
For your spring term, why is it theta 3 minus theta 2?
So
We're assuming theta 2 is bigger, aren't we?
So I assume that theta 3 was bigger the way that I've drawn this, right?
Oh.
So you can see how I drew my spring force here, my spring torque. Since I assume theta 3 is larger, it's going to fight this position, which means it's going to be equal and opposite on the other one. It doesn't matter. You can have it drawn the opposite way, right? If I drew it this way, right, it would be theta 2 minus theta 3. Right? Good question.
Okay.
Remember, there's multiple things that you choose how to do here, right? You're going to make certain assumptions, and your problem might look slightly different than mine, but remember, I'm going to grade it based on what you have on your paper, right? It's not a 1 or a 0. So that leads me to this point, right? Make sure make sure that you write down everything all of your work on everything that you do, right? The more work you include, the higher chance you have of getting more partial credit if in fact something goes wrong, right? Now, I understand, right? So I understand that I can't control your penmanship, and I'm not gonna make you take penmanship classes, and that's not the point of this. But I do ask that any work that you turn in is legible, right? Just please make sure that somebody can read it other than you. And then the other thing is, I really would appreciate it if you guys could work in a sequential manner. It just makes it easier when the grading time comes. So like if you step through everything, right, instead of just bouncing around your page, and then drawing arrows, hey, I get it. I mean, I do the same thing, right? Like I'll start working somewhere and then I'll draw arrows and stuff. But when it comes time to turn it in, please consider maybe rewriting it if it looks sloppy. That'd be it. But as long as I can read your work, I'll try my best to figure out what you're doing. The other thing is, if you don't put a coordinate system down on your page, I'm going to assume it's whatever one makes most sense to me, right? So make sure that you're always writing down your coordinate systems. Okay. All right. So enough of that, right? So how do we find Jeff? Right, Jeff is lost and we need to find him. How do we find him? Well, okay. We're going to use kinetic energy. Okay. What's the equation for kinetic energy? For a rotational system, right, in general, this would be 1/2 J omega squared, right? What is it for a translational system? Blake, you unmuted, but I heard nothing.
MV squared.
1/2 MV squared, yeah. What happens if you have a system that's both translating and rotating? What do? Well, energy is a scalar. You just add them. You add 1/2 J omega squared to 1/2 MV squared. But you can't do that. One's translational and one's rotational. Yes, I can, because they have the same units. So, all right. Just do it. Anyway, so this is completely rotational anyway, so it doesn't really matter. We're just gonna use this. Right, so 1/2 J omega squared, but I've got two things in my free body diagram. I've got two J's, right? So I can write my kinetic energy for this system as 1/2 J1 omega 1 squared plus 1/2 J2 omega 2 squared, right? So far, everybody's with me, right? We good? Okay. Does it matter how much kinetic energy I have in the system? No, it does not. It equals the kinetic energy. Now you're like, well, it should matter how much we have. Like, what if we only have a little bit? That's not the point of what we're doing. It's not the point of what we're doing. It's going to be some constant number, right? Kinetic energy is going to be some number. Okay, that's all that we care about. We're actually not going to solve this for kinetic energy. We are going to use this format to figure out what J is. Okay, what Jeff is. Okay. All right, so this is great, but I have everything in terms of omega 1 and omega 2. And if I look back at my free body diagram here, right, if I look back at my free body diagram, I said that this is in terms of theta 2, right? Which means that this also has to be in terms of omega 2, right? So I need to convert omega 1 to omega 2. Well, how do I do that? I'll do it through the gear ratio, right? So my kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 J1. Well, omega 1 is just 1 over n times omega 2, right? That's going to be squared, plus 1/2 J2 omega 2 squared. So is that really J2? Right? Is that really J2? So this is misleading. So I'm not going to call this J2, actually. We're going to call this J gear, J sub G. Right? And there's a reason for this, right? Because we're trying to combine J1 and the gear, right? And everything's going to be in terms of theta 2 or omega 2. And so what? So how do we do this, right? Well, we're almost there. We're almost there. So why everything's in terms of omega 2 now, right? I can do some algebra on this. And I can say, well, I'll have 1/2 of 1 over n squared, right? Because 1 over n squared is 1 over n squared, 1 squared over n squared, times omega 2 squared, so times J. 1 times omega 2 squared plus 1/2 G omega 2 squared. I can combine like terms. And I'll end up with this. Okay. Okay. So we're almost there. We're almost there, right? Kinetic energy equals 1/2 J omega squared. If I look at this, if I set these two equations equal that I have in green, right? I have these two equations. If I set them equal to one another, I get 1/2 J, let's call him Jeff, omega squared, omega 2 squared, is equal to 1/2. I'm going to run out of room. We'll do it down here. Is equal to 1/2, 1 over n squared, J1 plus Jg, omega 2 squared. These cancel. These cancel. I'm left with J effective. What was the inertia of that gear that we were talking about? It was an ideal gear. What was the inertia? That's right, Zach, 0. So that goes away. So it turns out for this system, the effective J is 1 over n squared J1. The question was asked last class, what if the two gears were the same size, right? What if gear 1 and gear 2 were the same size? Well, if gear 1 and gear 2 were the same size, n would be 1 and J effective would just be J1, right? Okay. Questions on this?
What happened to the JG that was in the parentheses?
JG is the inertia of the gear 1, right? Or it's not called gear 1. Let me go to the free body or the schematic. I'll show you. So we assumed, well, we didn't assume, right? So in this free body diagram here, right? This is the gear. This is JG, right? JG is 0 because it is an ideal gear.
Oh, okay.
Falls out, right? This guy, this gear G, right, has no inertia. It's inertia.
Okay.
So that just falls out. Now, what if this was a real world system and you had to include the inertia of that gear? Then you have some gear inertia that you include in your system, right? That's what you do. But for this particular system that exists in the ideal world, right? Jeff is 1 over n squared J1.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. We have any other questions? Guys, are you okay with this? Maybe, maybe not. You need time to think, wrap your head around it, maybe. The thing about this is, remember, we are saying that there is some total amount of kinetic energy for the part of the system that we have cut, right? There's some total kinetic energy that is defined by the effective inertia, right? The fact is that if you look at the kinetic energy equation and you match it to our general case, like we did here, and we set them equal to one another, you get that effective inertia. It's just the stuff that's in the inertia parentheses, right? The other way of thinking about this is that the other things that are in that equation do not have units of inertia, right? So you can add up all of the inertias that are in that kinetic energy equation, and you will get the effective inertia. It's a big idea, right? Because if we can chain that together, right, and we can come up with J effective, right, then when we do our analysis later, right, we can use that. So if we're going to talk about this as J effective, theta double dot 2, right? So we'll analyze J1 now that the J effective. We're going to analyze Jeff right now, right? So look at your free body diagrams and you should see it should look something like this. And I can plug some things in. But for real though, these lights turning on and off is really starting. It's really starting to trigger me. But for real. GCU, if you're watching this video, fix the lights in room 1, 2, 3, 5. Thank you. They're not going to watch it.
Isn't it unlisted anyway? So they can't even see the video?
Jeremy, you want to give me smart answers? Save them for the homework, okay?
Copy that.
All right. So if we plug in our truths here, right, we've got T effective. Could we plug in what we found for T effective, right, and say that it's N times T1? Sure, we could. Does it help us right now or does it matter? Not particularly. It's not going to change anything that we're doing. So let's just try to get everything in terms of theta 2 and theta 3 for right now, and T effective. Okay, so we got this, right? We'll algebra a little bit more. We're going to put our theta 2s on one side and everything else on the other. And that will be that, right? Because we said that our input was T effective and our outputs were theta 2 and theta 3, right? That's what we said. So hey, look at that. Could you write this in terms of, well, I really want to know what theta 1 does? Sure. So we could do that. We can talk about that in a second if you guys want. We can. But before we do that, we'll just call this equation 1. And we'll look at J2, right? So J2 theta double dot 3 is equal to negative TB minus TK. We'll plug in our truths again, our other truths. Negative B theta dot 3 minus K theta 3 minus theta 2, right? And if you do the algebra, J2 theta double dot 3 plus B theta dot 3 plus K theta 3 is equal to K theta 2, equation 2. Just leave these. Don't try to solve them for each other. Please just leave them. We wrote on a previous slide that this was also equal to theta 2 over theta 1. Right? We wrote that on a previous slide. And if you use that, you could substitute in for all the theta 2's something that was a function of theta 1, right? If you wanted to. It's not necessary, but you could. Right? For example, if you were interested in how theta 1 changes and you didn't have some, position sensor. Yeah. You guys have any questions on this? What's the point of showing you guys that effective inertia thing, right? Well, the point is that you've seen it, right? Now you've seen it, and that's an additional tool that you can use if you so choose, you so desire. Is it required for success? No, you can do things the long way, that's fine, but it's just something that for very complex systems makes things a little bit easier.
It looks like there's some maintenance guys in the hall. Maybe you could ask them to fix the lights.
They're busy across the way. Looks like they're all doing something in the laser room.
Okay.
No doubt, Dr. Jones has them working around the clock. No doubt.
Classic Jones.
Classic Jones. Indeed. Okay. Trying to think. I think we have time. Do we have time for one more? Do we have time for one more? I don't know. I'm gonna say I think we have time for one more. But it's not one that's on the sheet. We're gonna do a different thing. You guys have any other questions on this? You okay? I know. All right. So we'll at least start this and we'll work on this one together for a little while. All right, so figure 2A shows the schematic diagram of a seat suspension system. It's designed to attenuate road vibrations, right? So attenuate is a fancy word that means it's supposed to dampen them out. It's supposed to suppress them, right? So the idea of all of the springs and dampers in your car seat, right, is that you're not supposed to feel the bumps in the road, right? And for the most part, it does a great job, right? Because think about it, the road surface itself is very porous and induces a lot of vibration, right? But when you're driving in your car, you don't really feel any of those small ones. Of course, like if you hit a speed bump going 90, right, you're gonna feel that. But you're not going to feel any of these small vibrations, right? These very frequent and fast vibrations. Dare I say, these high frequency vibrations. So we want to derive the equations of motion for this particular system, right? And we see there's the driver who's got mass 2 or shoot. We've got the seat, it's got mass m1. We've got the floor of the cabin, right? And you'll see that that has a displacement that they're calling z0 of t. The seat itself has its own displacement, and the driver has its own displacement. So figure B here, right, the mechanical model, is a very simplified version of what's going on, right? And something that I think, well, something that I hope looks a little bit more familiar after the stuff that we've been doing the last couple of weeks, right? And so we've got some springs, we got some dampers, and we got some masses connecting everything, right? Okay. So what are we going to do, right? Well, we've got to draw a free body diagram for this particular system. So let's go ahead and do that. Right. So before we do that, I'm going to pull that schematic over so that we can all look at it while we draw the free body diagram. Okay, so there it is. Let's draw free body diagram. So we're going to need 2 free body diagrams, right? Because we have 2 masses. So we're going to do this, right? I've got the driver, right? The driver has some position associated with him or her of Z2. I've also got the seat, which has Z1. And I'm going to make a note here that overall the ground is moving with Z0 of T, right? That's going to be important. All right, so we've got to make some assumptions about how to draw our forces here, right? So if I move the ground up, right, I'm going to assume that that's going to compress the spring between the spring and the damper between the mass and the floor. So I'm going to assume that's going to compress. So I'll have FK, right, and FB, right, and FK. Right, so we're assuming that that's going to compress, right? Further, I'm going to assume that that's also going to compress the spring between the driver and the seat, right? Because why not? Because I can. That's one. So that's going to be FK2. FK2. All right, so what have I assumed here? Well, that means that I've assumed that Z0 is greater than Z1 is greater than Z2, right? Yeah. If Z0 is bigger than Z1, then that will compress that space. If Z1 is bigger than Z2, that will compress that space.
Are we ignoring gravity?
We are, because we're going to assume that we started with the preload of the person sitting in the chair. So the springs are already conditioned for that. Okay. All right, is everybody cool with these free body diagrams? See where they come from? They're comfortable. So what's my input? And what's my output? My input is the floor moving up. My outputs are, what do we call them? Z1 and Z2, right? So the displacement of the seat and the displacement of the driver. Yep. Mathematical truths. The linear system, it has a spring. Well, it has multiple springs, right? And these are free end springs on both sides. And I'm just going to write this general, but you know what? Why don't we write both of them? So FK1 is going to be Z0 minus Z1, K1. FK2 will be K2, Z1 minus Z2. FB1 is B1, Z dot naught minus Z dot 1. And FB2 is B2, Z dot 1 minus Z dot 2. Okay. So there we are. We got that. So now we got to apply this to our masses, right? So you guys want to start with the driver or you want to start with the chair? Where do we want to start? Driver or chair?
Chair.
No, one driver, one chair.
Chair.
Chair. It's two chairs. Whoa, what happened here? No, thank you. No, thank you. All right, so we'll start with the chair. So we're going to sum our forces. Well, let's go back to our free body diagram, shall we? What happened with mathematical truths? Who stole my mathematical truths? All right, anyway. We're looking at the chair. What do we have? Well, I've got positive FK1, I've got positive FB1, I've got negative FB2, and negative FK2, right? And I don't think we're going to have enough time to finish this one, so we'll get as far as we can, and then okay. So for the chair, we had FK1 plus FB1 minus FK2 minus FB2 is equal to M1 Z double dot 1. Yes? That's what I remember. So we'll get K1 Z naught minus Z1 plus B1 Z dot naught minus Z dot 1 minus K2 Z1 minus Z2 minus B2 Z dot 1 minus Z dot 2 is equal to M1 Z double dot 1. Okay, so that's where we're at. We have to algebra this, right? So what? Well, we want Z naught on one side and everything else on the other, right? So we'll have M1 Z double dot 1 plus B1 Z dot 1 plus K1 Z1 plus K2 Z1 minus Z2 plus B2 Z dot 1 minus Z dot 2 is equal to B Z dot naught plus K Z naught. So that was the fast algebra, right? I basically took anything that had a Z naught in it and I multiplied through and brought it over to the other side, and I left everything else as is, right? please feel free to double check that and make sure that it's okay. I think it was all right. And then we can talk about the driver, right? All right, so that's it, right? That's equation 1, done. Leave it alone, don't touch it again, right? We don't need to touch it beyond that. We're done. For the driver, what do we have? Well, on the driver, we only have negative FB2 minus FK2. No, sorry, those are positive on the driver, right? We have FB2 plus FK2 is equal to MZ double dot 2, right? So this one should be quicker to write. That's going to be B2 Z dot 1 minus Z dot 2 plus K2 Z1 minus Z2 is equal to MZ double dot 2. And for this one, I'm going to do the full algebra thing and put Z2 on one side and Z1 on the other. That's not, again, I told you guys earlier, that's not completely necessary to get credit, right? Unless you're explicitly told that you want everything in terms of global and local variables, right? But I like the way that it looks with Z2 on one side and Z1 on the other. And there it is, right? That's the guy. That's the guy. Now that was super fast, right? We did that super quick. Why did we do that super quick? Because we currently have 10 minutes left in class and I want to do the wrap up stuff for the week. So I did it super fast. Are you guys okay with the process of how to do that, right? A lot of this comes down to bookkeeping, right? A lot of this is going to come down to bookkeeping. Next week, just when you guys started to feel a little bit comfortable with this stuff, we're going to switch to electrical systems, which I know is a lot of people's favorite topic. I know you all love electrical systems. I mean, zero division, you guys even named your team after your affinity for your first professor for circuits. I mean, it's great. All right. Where'd I go? Apparently I hit a cable somewhere, so don't touch the cables. Message received. You guys have any questions on this? All right, so next week we start electrical systems. I'll post some example problems. By the way, the Tri-Quizzer points this week. We'll go from the time trials, which was also your participation, right? So congratulations, you guys all got participation points for the week. Good job. All right. All right, so now let's have some deep thoughts from Dr. D. All right. Which would bother you more? Being hunted by a wealthy industrialist on his or her private island, or finding out your boss has created a robotic clone of you to clean up his/her office? Which one of these would bother you more? I mean, I'm only asking the hard-hitting questions here, guys. Just the essentials.
I like the reference in the first one.
It's the most dangerous game.
The most dangerous.
So if I have a twin and the fact that someone's making another, like a clone of me, it doesn't really bother me that much, is that okay?
I mean, it's all about perspective, really.
Also, there's someone staring at you in the window.
Somebody is. I'm not going to acknowledge them. This is not.
It's Dr. Jones.
Hey, Dr. Jones.
It's too funny. All right. So it seems like most of you guys would be more averse to having being hunted. Interesting. The other class was completely flipped. personally, I think I would take more offense by my boss wanting a robot of me to clean his or her office. But I mean, it's neither here nor there. Really.
Isn't that kind of like a form of flattery though? Because they still want you to like be helping them even if it's not you.
That's what I was gonna say.
Like out of all their options, they're like, yeah, I want to clone this guy.
I guess I'm more cynical than that. I mean,
Yeah, they still have to. If they make a clone of you to clean up their office, they have to look at you more.
See, it's like it's not actually an effect on you if there's a robot clone of you, but being hunted on an island, that's a direct threat. That's all I'm saying.
And if your robot clone is cleaning his office, he appreciates that, and he represents that with your face, so he appreciates you more.
Sure. Perhaps. You guys have started to change my mind though a little bit. I will say that. All right. So we'll say, how are you guys feeling about this? Be honest, please. Be honest.
I had a question about the pendulum lab. Some people have asked me this, and I didn't know either. Are pairs turning in the exact same sheet, or are we just working on it together but writing our own individual reports?
Turn in one lab report for your whole group. And then I will make sure that everybody gets the grade associated with that and the feedback associated with that lab.
So only one person in the group needs to submit it?
Correct. So if you are in the bottom half of this, please seek me out during office hours. Make sure that you are getting your questions answered. I said this on the first day, right? I really want you all to succeed. I do. Don't have it out for anybody. But again, that don't mean that. Don't take that to mean that everybody's just going to get an automatic pass, right? There is a standard that I'm holding you guys to. I am here to help. I will help you in any way that I can, but you have to seek out that help, right? So please, if you are feeling like you're not getting stuff, you've got to come and see me, and we can talk about it, and we can try to get you straightened out, right? So please do that. And you guys are free to go. That's all I've got for today.
Thanks, Dr. D.
Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Thanks, Dr. D.
Thanks, Doc.
Thank you.
Quick follow-up question to that whole submitting the same lab thing. If we already worked on it separately and like we worked together obviously on the data part of it, but he already submitted his and I haven't submitted mine and we wrote two separate reports, what do you want me to do about that? Does that make sense?
Sure. If you want, Talia, you can turn in your own.
Okay. I feel bad because I didn't work on his report at all. I was just doing my own, so I don't want to like.
Sure.
Okay.
We don't want to stab each other in the back, essentially.
All right. Cool. Yeah. So. People are not down with Jeff, I guess.
All right, Dr. D, I will catch you later.
All right, Jeremy. Sounds good.
Because once again, I still have to catch up on a lot of stuff, especially that homework.
Definitely try to get some of that done. Then maybe you can come to office hours tomorrow and we can talk about it.
Yeah, which I got a question regarding that homework, actually. Would I be able to pretty much like